Good afternoon. In this video, we'll be talking about some of the social characteristics of autism spectrum disorder that I've observed in my classroom with my students. So some of the social characteristics are struggling to initiate interactions with others, struggling to respond to social interactions, and struggling to show interest with their peers. So this can look like a classroom of 9 students and not a single one of them are able to speak to each other without, as a teacher or the aides in my classroom, starting that interaction and prompting students on how to respond. Some of that is both that initiating the conversation as well as responding appropriately to those interactions. That struggling to show interest in peers, certain things like we may ask how your weekend was, or if you enjoyed a movie you saw or playing a game, what's your favorite food, something like that, showing an interest in another person, whereas my students don't. Their world kind of revolves around them and only them, so that's something that we try to initiate and work into our social skills as well. Things like personal space, taking turns on eye contact are very hard for my students. So and there can be something where I am working with another student and a second student is screaming my name from across the classroom and cannot wait 1 second to tell me what they need to. So we work on things like saying excuse me, and things like our patience and counting to 10 in our head while I finish working with the student. Those are some of the things that we use to help start to build those skills in my classroom. Eye contact is a tough one. So when we talk to people, we tend to give them eye contact. We tend to look them in the eyes so that they know that we're listening and we're present. That is very hard for my students, and we prompt that in class a lot. Can I please have your eyes? I need your eyes and your ears looking at me. Things like that to help with those things. But those are just some social characteristics that we see throughout autism that, like I said, I see in my classroom as well. Some other things are things like repeating what they've heard. So instead of engaging in a conversation and continuing that conversation further or more in depth, asking clarifying conversations or, asking clarifying questions or continuing that conversation, a lot of times they just repeat what they've heard. Exactly what you just said to them, they'll repeat back to you. So the conversation kind of dies down right there. They have a really, really hard time expressing their wants and needs. We use a lot of visuals in my classroom to help with that. And they also have a very, very hard time understanding the wants and needs of other people, whether that be students, whether that be the aides, or whether that be myself. So things that we need. So we use very clear, concise directions. A lot of times we use visuals as well as written on the board, not just verbal directions. So they're seeing and hearing it in multiple different ways. They also really struggle with social and emotional responsiveness. So we've talked about the social piece, but also with these previous characteristics, but also that emotional piece. So the empathy and kind of that, like having a big heart for somebody else. There's not a lot of emotional responsiveness to others. If someone's hurt, they don't necessarily run up and say, oh my gosh, are you okay? What happened? Can I help you? They just continue to do what they're doing. They have difficulty with social cues, those nonverbal cues, especially like body language, or when a conversation is dying down, they may continue to perseverate on a topic that we're discussing if it's something that they really enjoy. And so those are some things that we see throughout our class as well. Also, difficulty making friends. So this is kind of twofold. One of the things that it asked was things that we also don't see. My class is very good at making friends within the class, but those students are also together for 4th, 5th, and 6th grade. So some of it I think is kind of forced to a certain extent that they're with each other all day long for all those grades, and those are the kids that they're surrounded by. So in order to have somebody to play with or something to do, they do tend to gravitate towards each other. But as far as making friends outside of our class, that is very difficult, and you see the majority of the time at recess or PE when my students are out with gen ed students, that they do not gravitate toward those other students. A lot of them do not have friends that are not gen ed students. They gravitate toward kids in my class and kind of only stick together with those students. Something that I don't really see are my students completely by themselves. I do see that we have a class that is solely for students with autism and behaviors called ABIC, whereas mine is TBIC, Therapeutic Behavior Intervention. So my kids have more of the mental health pieces and not necessarily as strong autism characteristics, but they do have that autism label as well as that ED label. Whereas in the autism class, that autism label is that primary label, and they have some significant more severe autism than my students do. And so I see that a lot there, where their students are completely by themselves, not even interacting with each other a lot, but I don't specifically see that in my class. And difficulty with language. I also see that in our ABIC class, like I said, but don't necessarily see it with mine as a whole. So I do see things like my kids struggle with figurative language, so that language that is not explicitly written or explicitly explained. I see that they struggle with that, where they have to inference or they're taking a meaning out of something. That is tough for them. But as far as communicating, basic language that they need to communicate, that academic language that they need for class, I don't really see struggles with that. Hopefully this gives you a little insight into some of the social characteristics that I observe in my class on a regular basis. Thanks.